This is Hilary Jebiabibio, the Vice President, Higher Education at the National Union of Students, and you're listening to the Black History Month podcast 2020.
I'm delighted to welcome today Hilary Jebiabibio, Vice President Higher Education at the National Union of Students, as part of our Black History Month podcast series. So welcome, Hilary, and I'd like to also introduce Adnan Hussain, President of the Guild of Students. So also welcome, Adnan.
So hiya, thank you so much for having me on this podcast. It's a massive privilege to be featured on here, and I know that a podcast series is all the rage right now, especially now that people are at home and making sure that they're safe. So it's great to be on here. So a little bit about me and my background. I actually studied at the University of Bristol, where I was an officer before this role, and I studied social policy. So I think inadvertently I was walking the steps down to where I am today, but not realizing that this is where I would be. So I've had a very interesting journey getting into the student movement and ending up doing the work that I'm doing today.
Brilliant. So what role did you have as a student officer at Bristol Student Union? It is called Bristol Students' Union, isn't it?
It is, yeah. So I was the undergraduate education officer. So I was me, but without the postgrad side to worry about when I was at Bristol. And when I was there, it was actually really interesting because I ended up doing a lot of work with our postgrad officer as well. And so it felt like it all came together really, really smoothly. And we did lots of amazing work that I think really feeds into some of the issues that, we're speaking about today, some of the things that I'm sure you're going to be speaking about over Black History Month. And it's really exciting that being in roles like that, we can bring up issues like race and the implications of race and colonial legacy in those spaces and really transform education in a way that, transforms it from the inside out. And it was a real privilege to be able to have that space to do that when I was at Bristol SU.
Amazing. Just before I ask you stuff around some of the things you mentioned around attacking racial issues within university, I would just like to ask you, how did you actually get involved with student politics? Like, what inspired you to go and take that role at your students' union?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. I think whenever I've spoken to anybody about how they've got involved in the student movement and in student politics, I think most people get involved by accident. They don't realize they're doing it, and then they find themselves right in it. And so I think the best way to describe how I got involved is it dates back maybe to when I was at the end of secondary school and going into sixth form. And when I was in secondary school in year 11, going into sixth form, I come from Southeast London. So I came from a background that is, working class, and there wasn't very high participation rates when I was going to university. And so at my school, they had a lot of organizations coming in to try and support us as students to get to the best universities, or the universities that we wanted to get to. So I got into university through the help of a foundation called the Social Mobility Foundation, who help widen participation, teenagers, and I don't know what to call it, students, there we are, to get to universities of their choice and to be able to, have the skills and the help to be able to apply to the universities that they wanted to go to. And so when I got to university, I sort of got in, was really happy that I got in with this organization and for all of the support and help that they gave me. And then, as you do when you get to university, education swallows you up. You get so ingrained in your societies and your studying and your lectures, and sort of just forget about everything for a bit and just do university. And so towards the end of my second year of university, one of the roles in my student union, one of the part-time roles in my student union opened up, which was the widening participation network chair. So our system is network chair rather than part-time officer named. And at first I saw it and I thought it looks good, but I wasn't too sure that I wanted to get involved because I didn't know what the responsibility was like or what kind of change I could bring in. So I ended up with a lot of encouragement from my friends and my loved ones, going for the role and getting it. And once I got into the role, I met some of the officers, the full-time officers that were at my students' union. And they just embraced me with open arms. They really chatted to me about what was going on at the university. They talked to me about the change that they were doing. And one officer in particular, the then Equality, Liberation and Access Officer, got me involved in NUS's Black Attainment Gap, Closing the Gap campaign, which was amazing. And so that was my first sort of time really seeing the breadth of the student movement and seeing some of this important work going on. And I sort of fell in love with that project and fell in love with the student movement. And I think that all sort of peaked when I went to my first national conference last year and just met the passionate and enthusiastic people that were part of and leading the student movement. And I think I vlogged it, actually. I think it's on a YouTube video somewhere. But I remember sitting in my room one day and thinking, like, yeah, this is exactly the space I want to be in. This is, you know, as a student, first of all, I feel empowered to create change. But I think even more, as a Black woman, I feel that I'm seen. I feel that I can talk about, you know, my experiences, the things that affect me, the things that affect people like me, and from similar backgrounds to me, and I can be a part of making that change. And so, fast forward, like, ran for Bristol full-time officer, undergraduate education officer, and then by December, January time, I found myself filling in the nomination form for NUS VPHE, and then here I am, after messaging you and lots of other student leaders across the country, and across the UK. I've ended up here, which I'm really grateful for, and it just feels like a whirlwind. So although I didn't plan it, I'm so happy and proud to be here. And I'm sure that you probably have a similar story where you were just passionate about something and then you find yourself in the whirlwind that is the student movement.
Yeah, I guess I do. I mean, for myself, I guess I just, to be honest, it's completely different to your story. I was never involved. I was never actually involved with my guild other than Bhangra dancing in first year. I thought I'd give it a go, Indian dance. And I just gave it a go the first year. I didn't actually, to be honest, knew too much about student politics then. But as I guess like yourself, got more, you know, involved, more, you know, I decided, you know what, I want to do this again. So here I am again. And thank you for coming here again. And I'm glad you got voted in by your members. Just going back to an earlier point then. So I had a look at one of your old manifestos at your time at Bristol. And one of them was about diversifying or decolonizing the curriculum. And I'd just like to ask, how did your involvement in that shape what the University of Bristol's curriculum now looks like?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question, actually. And I think the first thing that I have to say about that is I remember writing that manifesto when I was running for undergraduate education at Bristol. And a lot of my passion and my discovery about decolonization and decolonizing the curriculum, as I put it on my manifesto then, was thinking about the fact that, you know, the student movement have been really integral in this conversation and in this movement to decolonize. And whilst I was at university, and we had an ongoing campaign that our BME network held, which was called Why Is My Curriculum White? And it was a campaign that allowed academics and students to come and talk really openly about sort of the narrowness and the remnants of colonial legacy embedded into what they were learning at university. And so when I started at Bristol and got the role, I think there was still a bit of back and forth between whether we say we should diversify our curriculum or decolonize. And I spent a lot of time sort of thinking about, you know, what was it that we wanted to do with the curriculum? What exactly was the problem, and what exactly did we want to do? And I think, you know, thinking about the problem, it's the fact that, you know, colonial legacy is deeply embedded in what we learn and within even the fabrics of our institutions. And so there was a particular sort of weight on my heart to sort of think about, you know, and I think this is when it really struck. There was what I think at one point I was reading something, I can't remember exactly what it was, and it struck me that like in order to diversify, you must first decolonize. You can't diversify what is already narrow and exclusive and omitting of other people's histories and past and their own stories. And so I went into my sort of first meetings with my colleagues, my ex-colleagues at Bristol, and I sort of sat down at the table and I was like, right, on this work plan for the year, you say you want to diversify the curriculum, but that's just not good enough. We have to decolonize before we think about diversity. And if we really want true diversity, decolonization is key. And so I went into there and I really, fought with the evidence of, so many student leaders and activists behind needs evidence of the work that they had done, and got the university, managed to convince them to change it to decolonize rather than diversify. And with that, I made sure that I reached out to a lot of people that had done the work and a lot of the people on the ground that were doing the work, and eventually got them the space in one of our university education committees to actually present what decolonization is and what it looks like tangibly. And through that and other things that were going on around the university community. I mean, last year around October, we got the EHRC report about racism on campus, and that was a real big push to, strengthen that argument. We were able to actually see the university agree to a decolonization group and being made to actually actively work on decolonizing the curriculum. And as much as I would like to say, like, I worked really hard and I really did work hard, especially in trying to push forward the work of those that came before me. I think some of it was also luck, if I'm being completely honest. I think I came into my role at a time where the university were, looking at curriculum reform and looking at how they were going to change up how we do the curriculum. And I worked with some amazing colleagues across the university to be able to get, decolonization on there really, really robustly. And so I think it all worked out for good, but I think, thinking about all of the things that are going on around us, especially, this year, I think it's been a big wake up call about thinking about active work on race. I think, that work being shaped to being what it is today is a real testament to how much, even when it's not in mainstream conversation, when we talk about these key issues that we know are important, it's important to keep going, because at some point there will be a point where we will see that change starting to happen. And we must, and this is why I love the student movement, we must be able to connect with one another and work with one another to really strengthen these campaigns and these key issues that we're fighting for, because ultimately when it gets done, we can all celebrate together, knowing that we all worked hard to make it happen. And so in shaping it, I wish I could say that, I was able to go into a room and tell the university that they have to do it, but really it was the work of so many people across the movement and people that came before me that made that happen. And I think it's incredible that that's starting up and really moving. So it's really exciting.
I'm just going to throw in another question quickly. So the University of Liverpool and the University of Bristol are both, I'd say, similar-ish universities, but obviously one's in the north and one's in the south. But sure. Both Red Brick, both Russell Group. I'd just like to ask if you could give some advice to the University of Liverpool on tackling issues around decolonizing the curriculum, what would it be?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And I think actually in talking about Bristol and the University of Liverpool's similarities, I think we both got similar histories in terms of how, in terms of complicity within, the colonial legacy. And so I think it's really great that I'm able to be on here and have that perspective. The advice that I would give the University of Liverpool is really simple. I think one of the things that we are sort of rooting our work in NUS at the moment actually is basing sort of our approach on the quote on a quote by Angela Davis, which says, "Radical simply means grasping at the root." And that's exactly the advice I would give to the University of Liverpool. I think when we think about it in terms of what's right, if we really want to see racism tackled and actually see that done in a lasting way, I would really encourage the university to grasp at the root, to really dig into the root, the histories of why racism is perpetrated structurally and interpersonally, and how that has affected, the education that they are delivering, the setting upon which they're delivering that education. And then I think paired with that, I think it's important that, in realizing that and really digging deep to find a root, there must be a sense of humility, and that the university take in being able to reckon with things that sometimes are really ugly and not desirable to find out, but unnecessary if you actually want to bring real lasting change in what you want to do. I think, if the narrative is still diversify, I would really strongly say decolonize must come first. And the perfect people to be able to push forward that work and work with is people like you, Adnan, and people like the student activists that are working so hard to get this work done. And unless there is a co-partnership, humility, and a willingness to really grasp at the roots, the work that you will do will ultimately be harder, because you won't be able to get the transformative whole-scale change that will actually bring in the results that students have been calling for so long, and the results that are needed to actually solve the issues of racial inequality in all its manifestations in the university and educational experience.
Thank you. That was a brilliant response. Just a question more on student unions then. So again, at your time as an officer, Bristol Students' Union, you managed to secure race equity training for staff members. What did this look like? How did you get that, and what were the outcomes of that?
Student unions, I think it's first and important to say, is that student unions are some of the most progressive places and spaces we find in the educational sector, but also in society. I feel like I look at the history of NUS, I look at the history of student unions, and we've been on the forefront of tackling social issues for so long. And I think sort of where my mind and my heart came to when I was thinking about race equity training within the student union is that as much as we fight for social justice, and we're really at the forefront of fighting for what are really fundamental ills of society in the world, and when we're fighting against that, I think sometimes it's hard because you're doing so many things outward. It's hard to look at what's going on in the inside. And specifically being a Black woman in that organization, I felt it was important that, even in me being able to work there in a way that I felt empowered and free and supported, I felt it important that we had an emphasis on making sure that as much as we're tackling race, in terms of confronting the university, confronting the government, confronting society, we were also making sure that we were tackling race in terms of tackling racial inequality within our own four walls. And so I, as a sabbatical officer, that we sit on executive leadership teams, and we're able to, lead the direction of the organization. And so something that I was really strongly adamant about is that, our staff needed to have race equity training. We needed to see that training there so we could actually have the skills and the tools and the knowledge and the ability to change, to actually go and do the work we're doing authentically and with the integrity that it needs to be done. And so I took that to my chief exec, who has left now, but she's a fabulous Black woman, Sam Budd, who's actually coming on to NUS for a little while. And she helped me to spearhead sort of making sure that race equity training came into the union, which was amazing. And all of our staff were able to get that race equity training. And I believe, and I may be wrong, but I believe Advanced HE came in to deliver that training, which was really, really useful. And I think as a result of that, and especially I think it got to come into fruition in a way that was a lot quicker than I thought. Especially with the murder of George Floyd, and thinking about the resurgence of people's awareness of the Black Lives Matter movement, I actually noticed a real change in how people were willing to come and speak to me about where they felt they wanted to know more about race and know more about what they could do to be active allies in tackling racism and racial inequality within our students' union or within our university or within wider society, whatever it was. They were really keen to be forthcoming in doing that. And I think what was particularly helpful was that I now felt that after they had that training, I was able to speak about my experiences and what I was going through in a way that was a lot less explaining the reality and more so explaining how I felt and how I was impacted. And on a personal level, that was deeply, deeply useful in me being able to feel like I could get the support that I needed. And as you know, like being people of color, and especially with me being a Black woman in that space, it's really difficult sometimes to do your role when you come from a racialized minority, because there's so many other things you need to navigate above the issues that you're fighting for. And so that was particularly impactful for me and really important, that I was able to see that come to fruition whilst I was there. And I know that more work is being done, which fills me with so much joy. So that was really good.
That was a really positive answer there, and definitely one, I guess, to encourage student unions to do themselves. I'd just like to turn the conversation now to the present day, I guess. So I would just like to ask, you've been in the role as Vice President for Higher Education at the NUS. What does that mean for you? And would you just like to generalise a day-to-day experience? But of course, I know that there is no, and Darren himself is actually an ex-sabbatical officer. So I'm sure we all know that there is no proper day-to-day bit, do we? So, but as best as you can, I guess, could you explain what you're doing in your role?
Sure. That's a really good question. And you are right. Day to day is so wild sometimes that sometimes I wish I had a standard day to day, because it would feel like I had a lot more control over what's going on than sometimes it feels like. So I think the first thing to explain is, what is my actual job? What does it mean for me to be Vice President Higher Education? And so I think the simplest way to describe it is that anything that covers any issues that happens within universities or higher education, it's my responsibility to work on or advocate for students about, and to make sure that I'm keeping an eye on, to ensure that students get the best possible experience and the education that they deserve in an accessible way. And so for me, personally, being Vice President Higher Education puts me in a position where I can really shape what education looks like on a whole scale level. And that's really reflected actually through the campaigns that we're doing this year, through our decolonization campaign that we're doing as one of our priorities, to our New Vision for Education campaign. My role is one of many roles that play a really integral part in making sure that when we are thinking about how education is shaped and delivered, we're doing it in a way that is mindful and really targeted at making sure that students are able to get the education that they deserve and that they want. And that's really important in my role. And we know around the fringes of that, we're just troubleshooting just anything that happens around the fringes. So with the A-level results day, I was working really closely with our VP, so our Vice President for Further Education, on supporting A-level students. And I was meeting a lot with ministers at that time to make sure that we were getting a message across about what was going on with students and how they were being affected. When it comes to the day-to-day, as I was saying before, it is really, really varied. I mean, sometimes I get into work and it's just emails or writing documents or feeding into blog posts or letters or writing press statements to give to the press when we're responding to what's going on. Sometimes, like, I'm at work and the minister for universities asks for a meeting and we have to get ready for that and be able to bring the student issues there and really strongly advocate. And so it's such a varied time. And I think probably what the most constant thing in my role is when I get to speak to the membership and student unions and officers. And so, like, one of the key parts of my role is being able to just catch up with you and seeing what you're doing. And because I am a people person, as I was telling you earlier, it's just so, like, energizing to be able to just speak to students on the ground and student officers. And that's probably, like, happily the most constant thing in my role. But it is a very varied role, and I do a lot alongside just a wonderful team that we have this year and for the next 2 years, actually. So yeah, it's great, but it's a lot of work representing students on a national level. But I wouldn't want to be doing anything else.
I mean, the NUS is essentially the students' union for students' unions, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
And what's your favourite bit of the role then?
Do you know what? I don't think I've actually spent time to sit back and think about what I enjoy the most. I think there are a few things that I really enjoy. I'm trying to think. So naturally, I would say when I get to speak to like the membership, when I get to speak to other officers and see what's going on the ground with you, because yeah, I just love interacting with the membership. When I think about like sort of day to day, what my favorite thing probably is, I think when I'm able to sit down with the team, so the officers and also NUS staff, and when we get to just reimagine what education looks like, and I think that's particularly true of decolonization. During our first few weeks in the job, we got to do our campaign planning, which I'm sure you're really familiar with, that like you get inducted, you get settled in, and then it's campaign planning from the get-go. And we did some really, really fun exercises where we just got to think outside of the box and be like, if there were no barriers in the world, if we could just like form something new and fresh and good for students, what would it be? And I loved the freedom of just being able to explore that and really think freely about, you know, what could we deliver for students that could look the best? Like, what is the best possible thing we can get for students, and how can we make that happen? And so I really, really enjoyed that and would happily do it again, happily.
What a really happy answer. Just as you mentioned, the NUS officer team, and obviously you've mentioned before around the liberation campaigns that you've been doing. Obviously, NUS, for those who don't know, have had a bit of a restructure, and there is now just one liberation officer. But I was just wondering, in terms of liberation campaigns, can you tell us what the changes are and how that's affected by the structure? What has changed, what hasn't changed within the Black Students campaign and general anti-racism or racial harassment work?
You are right. We have gone through a bit of a restructure, and essentially, like the purpose of that restructure was to make us work better as an organization and make us win for students, in a way that, you know, students would feel a greater impact. And so now the way the liberation campaigns work is that we don't have a full-time liberation campaign officer as we did before. So we used to have a full-time officer for each of the liberation campaigns. Now we've got our first vice president, Liberation and Equality, who is Sarah Khan, who is amazing. And she leads a group of liberation volunteers, so liberation committee volunteers, that, you know, represent each liberation campaign. So we've got a Black students campaign volunteer, we've got a disabled students volunteer, a trans students volunteer, LGBT plus women's, and so on. And so we still have people working in those roles, but they're now part-time and volunteer. And so in terms of, you know, how that impacts the way we do our liberation campaigns, Sarah is going to be doing a lot of that operational delivery work, but all of her work is going to be influenced by the work that the Liberation Committee want her to do and are calling for them to do. And so I think, you know, the way that has impacted the Black Students campaign and, you know, the ways we've done things is actually really interesting, because I think in many ways we've been able to embed liberation in our campaigns in a way that I think we've done in bits and pieces before, but now it feels a lot more whole scale. Like the fact that decolonization is one of our priority campaigns is a massive testament to, first of all, the work that Black students campaigns of the past have done, but also a massive testament to how important we take liberation at the National Union of Students. And I think it's also important to note that, like, we have made sure that we are embedded in our strategic aims, that within the 2 years that we're in office, we find a way to bring back those full-time liberation campaigns so we can get that work going again in the ways that we know the membership so desperately want to see. So it's changed and it's restructured, but I think it's just as powerful and even more impactful in how that work is going to happen. And I'm really excited to see the fruits of that change come across in the time we're in office.
Did you get any pushback from the student movement for that? Because NUS used to have the mantra, a Black officer in every union. And so when you don't have a Black officer in the union, I was just wondering how that was it very supportive by the movement, or was it quite difficult to get that reform pushed through?
Yeah, so I think that's a very important question, actually. I think when we think about reforms and what we had to do to make sure that this union could carry on going and carry on moving and bring in the wins that it does, I think obviously, myself included, I think we really, really struggled with, having to think about and having to act upon restructuring in the way we did, and especially because it meant we didn't have the full-time officers in this first part of the restructure. And I feel that although it was a really tough thing for us to do, um, I think like on the back end of it, I think we're in a good place because it's meant that we've got such a diverse officer team, for example, and so it means that like the people that we might have felt we've lost, we now have it embedded within the organization in a way that I think is even more impactful and incredible. And I think as much as we had to do that to make sure that we still had a fighting union for students, I think what is equally as important is that in recognizing that we had to do that, we also recognize the importance of making sure that we can bring those officers back, and we can bring those officers back to an environment where they can feel even more empowered to fight for liberation, even more empowered to be able to do their jobs in a way that they feel safe, empowered, and reared up and fired up to go and do some amazing work. And so whilst it was really difficult for us to do as an organization and as a national union, I think, especially in having the liberation volunteers, we haven't lost our officers at all. And I think, in the ways that we want our officers to be able to work in the union, I think although we've restructured, we're moving towards a space that when we do get them back and when they do come back, they're going to come back bigger, better, and stronger. And I think that's our biggest priority, and what gives me the hope to be able to know that working in this organization, I know that we haven't let that go in any way.
You've touched on it a bit, and I would just like to ask a bit more, if that's all right.
Sure.
So how will yourself and your fellow officers influence higher education institutions such as ours into tackling attainment gaps that exist within universities?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I think there's a few different ways. I think there's lots of different ways that we do it. I think first of all, I always have to start with our campaigns and what we are prioritizing for the next year or two. And I think with our decolonization campaign being one of our major campaigns from across the UK, we are actively going to be constantly advocating for higher education institutions and educational institutions even to really think about race in a way that is proactive, that is transformational, that is grasping at the roots, and that is really intentional in bringing about the change that we as a student movement have been calling for so long. The other ways that we are also influencing the sector is like in the work that we do day to day, sort of going back to our day-to-day jobs, you'll notice that you will often sort of find us speaking at events or speaking on the news about some of the work that we're working on. And so I've been speaking at events talking about decolonization and tackling racial inequality. And I know that the rest of the team have also been advocating in lots of different spaces for this change to happen. And I know that, within universities, it's really sometimes difficult when there isn't sort of that wealth of evidence that they feel like they're required to get the change done. But, the beauty of being in a national role is that we can collate that evidence and present it on a national level to organizations like UUK or the OFS and really get them to put that pressure on institutions to actually enact the change. What's actually interesting, though, is that with the nature of our work in decolonization, decolonization doesn't depend on universities sort of being at the forefront of pushing for that work, because naturally decolonization has come from the grassroots, and we intend for it to stay rooted in the grassroots and to grow from there. And so as much as we will be pressuring institutions to push for change and to actually bring in meaningful change, I think a big part of what we're doing this year is actually empowering the grassroots and students and officers and activists to really form that vision of decolonization and to go into their institutions and advocate for that in a way that is tangible and relevant to your local settings. And you'll see a lot of that coming to fruition in our decolonization campaign. And sort of that's the way that we've sort of envisioned how we are trying to, navigate the movement in this time. And I'm sure you must agree that, like, when we think about how times have changed, especially with COVID, I think it's even more important that we are reaching out to students on the ground and empowering them to push for change, and more so than we need to in terms of concerning universities, concerning going to lobby universities to change, because ultimately students are the ones that have the power. The reason that a lot of institutions released commitments and have committed to doing stuff in light of Black Lives Matter is because their students were hot on their heels, their student officers were hot on their heels, getting them to bring in that change. And so I think it's incredibly important to know that, our approach is that we want to re-energize and re-empower this movement to stand together and bring that change. And so whilst we are influencing institutions, we are much more empowering students in a way that is powerful and will bring about that meaningful change that we want to see.
That's really great to hear, and actually ties into what I was going to ask you anyways. So brilliant. So you did mention there about how it's yours and your officer team's role to, empower the student movement, sabbatical officers, local student campaigners. So what advice would you give them to those students, to those sabbatical officers who are focused on tackling racial inequality, who are tackling racism, who are trying to tackle the attainment gap, decolonizing curriculums, or even trying to implement any race equity training within their students' union? What advice would you give to those groups of students or officers?
Okay. First of all, I would say get involved. Get involved with your students' union, get involved with NUS, get involved in the campaigns that are going on around you, and actually soak in the ability to have organizations and people that are really passionate around you. I think some of this work can be incredibly taxing, especially if you come from an identity group that is directly affected by racism, that is directly affected by discrimination and injustices in our society. And so it's always important to surround yourself with people that are passionate and people that are ready to do the work, because not only does that mean you have people to come together with to get that work done, it also means you get that care and support that you need in order to be able to get through that work in a healthy way. And I think that's always the most important thing. Care is always so important. The second piece of advice I would give is research and organize. I can't stress enough how powerful it is to see groups of students and student activists grouping together and organizing, pockets of activism and work that comes together to feed into that wider goal. And so whilst racial inequality is just a massive issue to tackle, and there's so many aspects of it that we want to tackle, I think knowing especially what you are passionate about and how you want to be a part of tackling that, like, go ahead and do what you know you can do, and be confident in that. If the aspect that you want to tackle is thinking about, the intersectional realities of race and gender, or if you want to think about how, race intersects with sexuality and identity, I think it's important that you think about how you want to contribute to it, and you do it in the ways that you feel most connected to and passionate about. And if you feel a little bit lost in the breadth of it, I think it's important to just reach out and see where you can support existing campaigns and existing work, and that is ultimately, especially for actually non-Black people, for white people, for people that aren't in a racialized minority group, I think that's the best way to find ways of being allies in those spaces and empowering, people of color, Black people, to be able to do that work and get that work happening in a successful way. The final thing that I would say in terms of advice that I would give to students on the ground and student activists is, like, at the very minimum, just never be afraid to talk. I can actually say that I'm a talkative person, so, like, leave it to me. I can talk for London, England, and the rest of the UK. But I think what's actually more powerful than anything is when we hear the voices of students, and when we hear what exactly they want to see on the table, what exactly the change that they want to see happening is. And so if it means that you're talking to your lecturers or your sabbatical officers, or or if you're writing to your MP or sending an email to me or my colleagues at NUS, your voice is probably the most powerful thing that you can have. And where you feel like your voice has been taken away from you, or you haven't been able to have your voice be heard, speak louder, and speak as much as you can anywhere you can. Because when you start the conversations and when you get people to hear what you have to say and hear what your experience and your reality is, then that is ultimately what is going to win the hearts and minds in order to bring about that change that we need to see post hearts and minds. Once you get people believing and feeling, they are much more willing to be able to do the work that you see coming to fruition, and that doing and manifesting comes across in a way that is so much more powerful than you would think.
That's some really sound advice there. So what you essentially are saying basically is, if you're interested in tackling this massive issue, talk to your peers, talk to your lecturers, talk to your students' union, talk to your officers, and then hopefully a combination of those things, you can then bring that forward to the university.
Yeah.
Brilliant, thanks. Since you stepped foot into Bristol in your first year, what has been one of your proudest achievements within the student movement till now?
Goodness me, that is a really good question. I feel like you've caught me out, because I feel like I've been going full steam ahead. I haven't actually taken that time to really think about like what has actually happened in the time that I've been here. I don't know, I think so. Like, as I was saying before, I think it's hard for me to sort of think about a proudest moment, because I always feel like I can't really claim anything, because I know that there's so many people that have come before me that have done such incredible work. However, when I think about it, what am I most proud of? I think I'm proud of the fact that I've been able to go into spaces and have frank conversations with people that have, maybe in the past been resistant, or maybe I've never heard about some of the things that I've been talking about before, and just like be really stark and honest with them and get them engaged in some of the things that we're passionate about. And again, I think specifically about race, because I sort of feel like that's been something that I've never really not ever talked about in any aspect, in any environment that I've been in. But sort of, especially in this role, actually, in the short time that I've been in it so far, I feel that I've been able to go into rooms with like big names that I probably think haven't necessarily had these conversations before. When I've been able to like even meet ministers, or go to big sector bodies, or like even just present to, conferences where there are students and staff and lots of people involved. The fact that I can like sit there and be like, this is my experience, this is the experience of students, this is the real life like experiences of what is going on the ground, and you need to deal with it. I think it makes me proud that I've been able to get the platform in this role, and the platform through the student movement to really advocate and fight for those students and get their voices into the room. And so I wish I had something more tangible to say. And maybe if you catch me again in 2 years, I probably might have something, or even in a year. But I think right now, what I'm most proud of is the fact that I've been able to get the trust of students to be able to go into spaces and say exactly what is going on in their lives, and get people starting to think about actively listening and responding to that. And I think that makes me really proud to be a part of, what you do every day and what I get to do every day, and in what is just a bizarre but an amazing job.
I think just to like wrap things up then, I guess, can you give 3 top tips of advice for students who are interested in getting involved with the work that you are doing with the NUS around liberation and around racial equality?
Yes, I've got the 3 stood up in my head already, just like that. First of all, get involved with our decolonization campaign. It's going to be far reaching, it's going to be all encompassing and all involving. So like follow us on social media at NUS_UK, I think, and watch out for what we're doing. There's going to be lots of calls to action, and we are definitely going to be, calling on students and activists and officers to be involved, because you are the center of this movement and you are the fuel of this movement. So follow us on social media and get involved in our decolonization campaign. The second thing that the second top tip I would say is get involved with your students' union. Like, if you are from Liverpool and you haven't interacted with the guild, this is your sign to interact with the guild, and get involved in the work that they're doing. And I know that, like, Adnan, you and your team are a passionate team. And so it's important that get involved in the work they're doing, shape the work they're doing, and make sure that your voice is right up there front and center so they can advocate for you strongly. And the final top tip that I would say in terms of getting involved in our work is just making sure that anywhere you are, any space you're in, use your voice. Like, I do you know what I think the best thing to go into meetings, or the best thing to do, the best thing I feel whenever I'm pushing for change in any space, when I go into spaces and it's like, oh, we heard from this student that this was their experience, or like this survey that, you know, students filled in shows that students are agreeing with what you're saying, and so we're ready. You don't even need to tell us to do it. Students have already told us, you just need to show us how. That fills me with so much joy, because I know of the power of the student voice. So that's my 3 top tips. Like, follow us on social media and see when we call you to action. Get involved in your student union. Like, they're incredible. They're why NUS exists. And finally, use your voice. That is, you know, that is the minimum campaigning you can do. And even that is the most powerful that you can be in terms of the impact that you can bring. So yeah, do that and you'll be well on your way.
Thanks, Hilary. And again, just to echo Hilary's second point, yeah, obviously do get in touch with either myself or my 3 colleagues, Imogen, Fionn and Chloe, who are the 3 guild officers. Just drop us a line if you're interested in some of the work around racial equality, and we'll get back to you. Thank you very much, Hilary, for joining us.
Well, it was great to hear from Hilary there, and it was no surprise to me that she did talk an awful lot around the student voice and the importance of that. She did say it was so important that people hear about people's experiences and they hear their views. She talks an awful lot around the power of the student voice to affect change.
Yeah, I picked up on that as well. I really liked the way she talked quite openly about how her remit is to go into spaces and have frank conversations with a view to getting people engaged around these issues that students are most concerned about. I like that she was really willing to speak about her experiences and her ideas for change. It was obvious from the conversation that her courage and passion is incredibly clear as she's speaking, and also as she's thinking about how she wants to affect change for the students that she represents. And I think we've got a lot to learn from that in terms of having courage and being passionate about what we're invested in. Well, there's lots in that conversation that you may well want to think about and reflect on. We'd really love to hear back from you, to hear what you think about that episode. Please do tweet us at Live Uni Academy, and you can also find us at eLearnerMatt or at Alexandra_Owen on Twitter.
And we're really grateful for those who have taken the time to either rate or review our show in your podcast provider's app. And so if you are an Apple user, please do take the time to review our show, as it will help others find us. Bye for now.